Welcome to the Biotech Startups podcast by Exceeder. Join us as we speak with first-time founders, experienced scientists, serial entrepreneurs, and biotech investors about the challenges and triumphs of running a biotech startup. Gain actionable insight into navigating the life sciences industry in each episode as we explore the business of science from pre-seed to IPO with your host, John Chi. The purpose of the Biotech Startups podcast is to provide general insight into the ever-changing world of life sciences through the experience of a variety of guests. The use of information on this podcast or materials linked from this podcast are at the user's own risk. The views expressed by guests and any employee of Exceeder on the podcast are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of Exceeder or content sponsors. Any appearance on the program does not imply an endorsement or recommendation of any product, service, or entity referenced in the podcast by Exceeder or by its guests. In our last episode, we spoke with Steve Visco about global competition, IP strategy, and patent litigation. If you missed it, be sure to go back and give it a listen. Today, we're excited to chat with Steve about scaling your startup, applying for grants, securing strategic corporate financing, and attracting and retaining top talent. So sit back, relax, and let's get started.
So, it sounded like the early days were kind of had this like heavy, you obviously are still very focused on IP, but the early days was like generating IP, generating some licensing revenue. That was a good way to kind of bring in some cash. And I'm going to imagine you also had to bring in some cash from other means. And I know, you're very experienced with writing grants, and I know you've secured
we're
a
kind
ton
of
of grants.
Kind of unusual that way. Largely because of my experience at Lawrence Berkeley, in actually writing rather large grant proposals, PolyPlus became very adept at bringing in government contracts and government grants. So we grew the company with non-dilutive funding in a sense. So the only danger with doing that is you want to make sure you don't go in a direction that isn't where the focus of the company is, right? So that can be a problem. Like there are these grants called SBIR, some people call them SBIRs, right? Small Business Administration grants. And there are clearly companies who just live on those things, right? And they're $100,000 a pop. And so you can just keep doing these things, but that doesn't take the company in any particular direction, typically. So I think in our entire history, I think we took one of those, but they're kind of a pain. There are a lot of paperwork. So we focused on, large granting organizations within the government where you can bring in $10 million programs, $5-10 million programs, or, in some cases even larger. And then made sure that whatever money we're applying for was, a battery technology that was either already on a path or that we were pretty confident would take us to the right place. And so, I think we probably brought in close to 100 million that way. Quite a bit of money.
I can imagine that you get pulled in a bunch of different directions when, it's like the DOE or the DOD have very different, they're like, we want to do it this way. This is the project that we want done. How do you stay true to your North Star, like when working with these big orgs? That's
always a little tricky. It really is. But I think one of the problems, but there's no way around this, right? Is anytime you get a government grant, two things are going to happen. You're going to have some level of reporting. So you're going to be writing reports, status reports, and then you're going to be audited, right? And a lot of small companies can't handle the auditing requirements because they're rather complex, right? So you're subject to government audits. They have to make sure that the money's they're not seeing a bunch of BMWs in the parking lot. Grant. They don't make sure they know where the money's going, and there are obviously certain rules and regulations as to what you can charge and what you can't charge. So the auditing requirements can be burdensome. And the reporting requirements are not trivial. And for all of these programs, it depends on, who the funding organization is. But like Department of Energy has a division, ARPA-E, which is like DARPA, but it's for energy. And so they set a really high bar, right? They want transformational technology. So it's not incremental advances to existing technology. They want things that are going to change the game. And as you're moving along a path and then reporting metrics and performance, if it looks like you're either kind of standing still, you're not kind of pushing the ball down the field, they can just say, okay, done. They don't have to continue that grant. They can stop you.
Whoa.
And for sure, if they detect any level of fraud, and I mean in terms of reporting results, done. And they have stopped some of those awards. They've stopped them dead in their tracks. And I would say that's why, fraud is obviously not tolerated with any of these organizations, but some are more careful in how they track all this stuff than others. But for sure, there are reporting requirements, and those take time. So if you get even if you've got money coming in from a group of investors, then they may not have you reporting regularly, but they certainly want to know what you're doing with their money. So
Totally.
It's just a different way of looking at progress.
And are these to keep your North Star, can you negotiate with them to keep, or is it just
I would say no. Once you sign up, you've signed up. That's why you have to be very careful what you write in your proposed work, right? When you lay out a research plan for them, like you say, we're going to do XYZ over 2 years, you just have to make sure that, every step of the way, all the things that you kind of laid out are exactly what you want to be doing for the next year. And we've always done that. We've always written our proposals that way. Like we might be sometimes a little bit too ambitious, like, oh, this is a lot harder than we thought, but they know it. If they see that the things that you're doing are wildly difficult, they'll cut you slack on those things. Because that's the whole thing about blue sky type of development. Like when you're not aiming really high for a really difficult goal, the funding agencies understand that, you may not get to 100% where you said you want to get, but maybe get to 70%. They're not going to stop you for that.
Gotcha. And I guess, if you were to give tips to someone who's about to explore these government grants, what would be just some core fundamental tips to writing good grants?
I would say, so it's kind of in a sense, it's not so different than pitching venture cap, right? In the sense that you had better be excited about what you're doing. You better be able to explain why it's important. Again, why should I care? That question. And how you're going to execute. And then probably, I don't know, maybe above all those things, it's always about team, right? And the venture guys will push that a little bit harder because they know if they provide funding to a company to get something done, it's quite likely that you're going to hit a speed bump, right? Like something's going to go wrong. Now, if that was the only idea that you had in your head, then you're probably done, right? When you hit that speed bump. But if you got a really solid team, strong people, then you're going to figure, there's going to be a workaround. You're going to say, okay, we hit the speed bump, but if we change XYZ and modify this and do that, it should work, right? And that really has a lot to do with the quality of the people that you're funding, so
it really is not so
different.
Not so different.
The rules are a little different, but and obviously storytelling, right? I've read plenty of grant proposals where it's just painful. I don't want to read them, right? They're just horrible, right? It's don't fund these guys, and every once in a blue moon, you read something and it's almost like reading a good novel, page one, you kind of get an idea of what they're after. And then they kind of walk you through maybe other technologies that failed, why their approach is going to pay off, how they're going to do it, who the people are doing it, and you get to kind of a conclusion at the end. It's like, wow, I learned something and I actually enjoyed reading it. You're certainly in much better position then to get an award. And the other thing is, I would say, don't ask for too little. It's always better to ask for too much.
Will they come back with a counter? They
will. If they like what you propose, they'll come back with a counter. So I've had many experiences where we've asked for 10x, and they say, yeah, we love this proposal, but we only have 5x. And in some cases, after 2 years of doing that particular work, they gave us the other 5x.
Wow.
So
Wow.
that has happened, So yeah, so it's always good to ask for, and then you always can cut back the scope. So if you say it's going to cost, like again, 10x dollars, and they say we only have 5, then you say, okay, but I'll have to cut back the scope, right? Because otherwise it doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
Then you look like you're a liar, right? Like, well, I said it was going to cost this much money. I'm going to do, all of it for half the money. It's like something doesn't add up there.
Yeah.
So you have to be prepared to scale it back and yet still do something worth doing.
Interesting. And I love how, I think as I was, going through just like, STEM training and like biochemistry, writing was really not emphasized, like very, very little.
Right.
And
that's right.
Like patenting, getting grants,
right?
Like you pitching and writing grants, and then also, pitching and writing, basically your pitch.
Very few faculty are going to walk you through that. I have one friend who's, teaches at Berkeley, who advises his students to take acting classes. And their first response is like, what, acting, like, so you want us to be frauds? And he's like, no, I want you to get comfortable talking in front of an audience that you don't know and getting them to engage with you and getting them excited about something. Because if you can't do that, you're going to have a hard time raising money.
Yeah, I can only imagine. I mean, it's like, you're just like reading this proposal. You're like,
I've read so many bad proposals. I read just like, just the most horrific things.
Yeah.
I don't even know what they're trying to do. Like,
and that's a shame too, right? Because there's probably a bunch of great like technology that just never sees the light of day because it can't be effectively communicated.
Right. Well, you probably know the story, but Donna's great aunt, right? She won the Nobel Prize in medicine. But it took, an extra 30 years for her to be recognized. And part of it was sexism, right? Because she was a female scientist at a time there weren't so many. But she also admits in her book that part of it is that she doesn't think she was a very effective communicator. She was not able to get across to her audience, why what she was doing was so important and what the implications of her work was. So it was some of that as well, So she still got the prize, but like 80 years old when she got it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I was going to say, so like when you were starting PolyPlus, you had these licensing revenue streams. Clearly, you were like, a big source.
We had angel funding to start.
And was basically after that angel funding was venture capital just,
Actually, no, what happened with us was kind of interesting. As we were working through the angel funding, we almost immediately went into a joint development agreement with a large chemical company that was interested in batteries. And they were just paying our R&D expenses for like 2 years.
Oh, wow.
For some minor first right of refusal to do something with some of our technology. So that was a pretty good deal for us. And then shortly after that, another chemical company came to us and cut a deal investing into the company. So we've never taken venture. Now we have had strategic investments from a variety, but we've never actually taken venture capital.
And that's super interesting to me because like I think especially in California, which obviously the birthplace of Silicon Valley,
it's all capital,
venture. Right? It's all venture. Yeah. And when you're completely surrounded by it, was it a conscious thing? It was like, we're not going down this path.
I have to give credit to Rudy because Rudy was not a fan of venture. He really wasn't. Our first CEO was not a fan of venture capital. So he much preferred to get strategic investors on board. You give away far less equity that way. It's it's a little more complicated doing that. I mean, venture brings certain things that can be helpful too, because quite often they'll have advisors. They'll be, very adept at bringing in senior management to help the company. But Rudy was, he certainly did not want that. So now, of course, we're talking to all sorts of companies about potential investment. So, the strategy has changed a little bit, but in the early days, it kept us alive because, venture capital, if they're going to fail, they want to fail fast, right? So for a young company, if you do bring in venture and they don't see sufficient progress by the time the money's burned, they'll sell the IP and dismantle the company very quickly. And there are a bunch of companies in the early days when we set up that went that route. When we saw, I mean, probably the first 50 companies out of LBL all failed, right? I mean, failure rate's pretty high, right? There are a few standing, but obviously being the second company out of Lawrence Berkeley Lab, and now we're in the throes of starting to manufacture. So we're pretty unique.
And it's not so. That leads me to my next one. Now that you're looking to manufacture, that it sounds like, okay, we need like large capital investments.
Yeah, that's
too.
right. No, that's right.
That's not a small sum.
Yeah. Although oddly enough, we have some of that manufacturing money did actually come in from very specialized government grants that support manufacturing, right? So the Biden administration is very proactive right now in battery tech and semiconductor tech, right? So they want to pull a lot of this back into the US. I mean, Europe's looking at the same type of stance as well. Like, it's not a great situation to have all your batteries that are going into your cars coming from foreign countries, right? If you can avoid that, if you can stop that. So there is in the battery space, and I think also the semiconductor space right now, there are actually government grants and loans and things available to help companies start manufacturing. So one of our technologies is seawater battery. It runs on, basically the cathode, the positive electrode is the ocean. That, we got a large government grant to support manufacturing. So amazing. That's ongoing right now. Yeah.
Yeah. I think like something, kind of like I was saying, like companies that are, for life sciences, a lot of it is Boston and California.
Yeah. Right.
It's like it's just like you raise venture, you do it.
Yes.
And right. I think, not to knock venture, because I think you're right. Like venture is great for a lot of reasons. There's pros and cons to everything, but I think
that's right.
It's incredibly important for founders to know their options.
Right. I think that's the right way to phrase it. That there's more than one way to do this, right?
Yeah.
Because I think for a lot of young companies coming out of academia or from whatever corner of the world they're starting, there are. I think people don't really think venture is it. Like you got to go venture cap and then you get started. Obviously, there are angel investors, which and they those are not going to be as large a check, but they're not going to be so restrictive in terms of control of the company. And the venture guys typically want to get control pretty quickly, right? The angel investors don't do that, right? They typically don't want that. Obviously, if you can get government grants, there's none of that. They don't take equity at all. So I think it's important to know that there are multiple ways to get things rolling. It's not just, venture and that's it.
And so it's not like you mentioned your kind of strategic like investments, like from industry. How do you were they just knocking on the door? How do you like, for example, if I'm starting a company, I'm like, all right, how do I go make a big corporate interested in me and want to, provide me with resources?
Of course,
how do you do that?
You want them coming to you, right? Because it's always tough if you're knocking on their door, because a lot of people are knocking on their door.
Yeah.
One way, there's really kind of two ways, I would say, that come to mind. One is the conference circuit, right? So, you give a spectacular talk at a conference, you will almost always get approached by a strategic afterwards because they're looking for ideas all the time, right? If you look at, most of these big conferences, 2/3 of the audience are non-speakers. They're not speakers, right? And quite often they're corporate types that are scouts. They're scouting for talent. They're scouting for technology. So that's one way to do it. And the other, of course, is like a press release. It's just something, if you can do that in the right way and get into the right journals or newspapers, that can create a lot of attention as well. So beyond that, I don't know, but I would say it's, in general, it's always a better situation to have them asking you if they can get involved versus the opposite, right? Which is tough.
Yeah. Doing it cold sounds absolutely really so tough. Hard. And when, so when I'm kind of contrasting the kind of when you get a grant, you are making sure you do all your the scope of work, the timeline, everything upfront. Make sure, because that is what the government is going to, basically fund you on and hold you to it and audit you.
Yeah, there's another part of it as well, and there's probably no way around that. It's pretty rare if you're applying for government grant. It's difficult if nobody knows your name, right? That is difficult, right? Because particularly if you're asking for like a big check. So credentials clearly help. They're going to look at, where did you go to school? Who are you? What have you done? How many publications do you have? Those things are going to count. But sometimes sometimes it'll just take a few tries for those people to kind of get to know who you are. Giving talks at conferences will help there as well, because the government guys go to those conferences too.
So it's like a double whammy. You get.
Yeah, for sure. You can imagine it. Nobody wants to spend money, and have it kind of end up being kind of a waste, where they can say why, if they can say, if the person that program manager works for says, why did you give these guys $5 million? It's like, this is garbage, right? They did bad work. If it's Harvard, MIT, Caltech, you're going to say, well, it's Harvard. It's, for God's sakes, it's MIT. This guy's, got 10,000 papers. So they have cover, right? So,
yeah.
It's just a lot easier, right?
Yeah.
So those guys already have an advantage, right? That doesn't mean that a young person without exactly those credentials can't get money, but it does mean that they're going to have to do something to satisfy those kind of questions that the reviewer is going to have. Like, why you? Why should I trust this particular company to do a good job on this work? And there are different ways to do that. In some cases, like if it's the Department of Energy and it's, they're launching a new program, many of those times they do that, they have a period of time where you can actually meet with them in their offices, and talk to them. And then they get a sense of who you are, how clever you are, what your idea. So now once they've actually put out the call for funding, that's almost always a quiet, you're not allowed, they can't talk to you, right?
Got it.
After that, no. But prior to that occurrence of launching of some kind of a call for proposals, there's usually a period of time where you can go and visit with them and sit down. That most of those guys will enjoy that, right? They like meeting with young scientists and hearing their ideas, but they don't have a whole lot of time, so it has to be pretty focused. It's like kind of like the elevator pitch. You really have to get them excited about some new idea.
Absolutely. And when, in contrast, when you're, you have interest from a corporate is it a similar process where, you scope out the work? Do you how much are you in the driver's seat? Like when PolyPlus is working with a big corporate, are you able to choose your North Star, or is there an active negotiation?
You are because, partly because they're engaging with you because they like the star you've chosen, right?
Yeah.
Like you've made some kind of presentation, they've gotten or they've heard about you from someone. And so they're already excited. They think you're doing this really, groundbreaking work. So usually you're already kind of in the driver's seat. And after that, it's just a question of how much money they're going to give you, for how long, and what are the milestones going to be? That gets tricky, right? So you're going to have to map out some kind of metrics so they can measure as you're moving through this program, your progress, and then report back to their bosses that, they're doing great work. This, the technology is moving along. This is a good investment.
And would you say, I'm, it sounds like with these corporates that are, collaborating with you, there's probably a ton of difference between like a US corporate and let's say an international corporate. Is that something where you just need to you just need to learn the business culture?
Yeah, it's trial by fire. I don't think you can. I don't think you can really necessarily prepare. I would say in general, this is speaking very generally, right? The Japanese are very skeptical because they know that Americans tend to exaggerate, and so they're very methodical, in kind of doing diligence to ascertain whether or not they really believe what you're saying and see if there's a good match. but they're very, and also in general, they're extremely good engineers. They're very modest, pretty easy to deal with, but slow. They usually work by consensus. And then some of the Korean companies we've worked with are, I would say, more aggressive, and sometimes in some cases can make decisions very quickly, but they can be on your ass when you're going through the program. They can be really tough. They're pretty tough managers. So there are cultural differences certainly between those. And we've worked with European companies. European companies, I think in general, are pretty similar to the way American companies work, with some exceptions. Not obviously not all European countries have this kind of entrepreneurial bent, right? Like you don't see a lot of startups in Germany. It's pretty rare. I think in the UK, maybe a bit more common, but I mean, nothing, there's no place quite like the US or particularly California. We have so many young scientists and engineers coming out of universities, starting companies, very quickly. Other than, I think Israel would be the other example. They have a very high entrepreneurial, start rate. I mean, it probably relatively, very close to what California does per capita. But I can't say we haven't done any deals with Israeli venture. But we have certainly worked with strategics in Japan and Korea and Europe, so, and they're all slightly different.
Yeah, it really sounds like you just have to do it. And then
you really just, and if it doesn't work out, it doesn't work out. And that certainly can happen.
Yeah, you got to be ready. I think it's like you just got to know when it's like you got to be truthful to yourself to know when there's a fit or not, and not force it.
That's right. That's right.
And I was curious, as you've kind of you're continuing to expand relationships, grant, all of these elements, have built up such a wealth of experience, and as you build your team, I mean, you're in an innovative field. How do you keep the team creative and innovative without having all this previous experience weigh you down, or not weigh you down, but you got to question the status quo? How are you keeping an innovative culture? That's tricky. Yeah, it's definitely tricky. I would say recruiting and retaining talent is tough, right? Partly because there's so much happening in California, right? So you always have this kind of, sucking noise just outside the door, right? Yeah.
Grab you. And we've had that happen. So, you bring young talent in, that in the battery space, look, there are no real universities that teach battery tech. I think San Jose State maybe has a master's program in battery manufacturing and engineering, but in general, it doesn't matter what whatever discipline, and typically the disciplines for battery tech are going to be material science and engineering, mechanical engineering, electrochemistry, chemistry, maybe physics. That would be a bit unusual. But so you bring in these new people, and they come from a variety of disciplines. They're all going to have to be trained. An example would be like a mechanical engineer. Well, mechanical engineers typically are pretty comfortable with plastics and metals and ceramics and 3D printing of various structures, but they're not going to understand which organic liquids corrode which plastics, right?
Yeah.
And which materials cannot be in contact with one another because they're going to react. I mean, so you get into these cross-disciplinary areas that the only way you're going to get that experience is by working at a company. Now, once you've worked at a company like PolyPlus or a company like PolyPlus for a couple of years, you probably have a skill set that's in pretty damn high demand. And so that's the big problem, is because of LinkedIn and other recruiting organizations, right? People figure out who's working for you, and they say, wow, here's a guy who's worked in the battery space, mechanical engineer for 2 years. Let's get him. And it happens all the time. So you can't really avoid that. That's just part and parcel of the scene. But the prime people here who work in innovation, who come up with the new ideas, that team has been together for more than 20 years. So, wow. And I think that's partly because we all work together well. We all like one another. It's been an exciting time. So, yeah, you could go to a different company, but it would take a while to build that kind of team, the team that we built here. So that certainly helps retain top level talent, but it's always going to be an issue. There's no way around that. I'm sure, pharma's probably exactly the same, but right now in the battery space, there aren't enough people to go around. So everybody's poaching from everybody else. And it's a constant battle.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Difficult, right?
And I mean, it sounds like it's a very multidisciplinary approach. So like, the PolyPlus, boot camp is basically makes you like a warrior. Like it makes you.
Yeah,
like,
no. People trained here learn a lot, right? They become quite adept at a number of things. And they're, there's no substitute for that, So obviously the way we do things in our technology is different from a lot of the other battery technologies that are out there. And it has its own idiosyncrasies that, we have to train our people to deal with. But yeah, and that may be true of other, I'm sure it is of other technologies as well. But for sure, I would say, people don't really become productive for a year to 2 years.
Oh, wow.
In fact, you're losing productivity when you make a new hire. That will slow you down. No, I mean, it'd be very rare for someone to come into other than maybe people who are working on production lines that have already done that kind of stuff. But in innovation, where you're developing new technologies, taking on new challenges all the time, it'd be extremely rare to have someone come in from the get-go and be productive. So that's where you also have to be careful, because if you hire too many people right off the bat, you'll be doing nothing but training and not making much progress. Yeah. It can be a huge time sink.
It kind of runs a little, I mean, obviously in like 2022 is a different year, but 2021 is just like, it's as if a startup's company's job to just hire. And
that's right.
But it kind of seems like there's kind of the PolyPlus way is a little bit more like methodical, like, and
yes,
and less just like a shotgun approach where we're just like bringing everyone in.
Pretty careful. I mean, I'd say on the technician level, you can kind of take maybe more of a shotgun approach, because you need techs. They're going to be coming and going. But the difficulty there is that there's some very large companies that have hired a lot of battery techs, and so it's difficult to find them. It's just difficult. We've had cases where we have 5 people lined up for interviews, and they just don't show up because who knows why, right? They just either they got an offer, but they don't they're going to call you to tell you that they're not coming in. It's kind of the Wild West that way. Everybody's hiring now, so this is a little bit crazy.
Yeah, and has it gotten like, I mean, obviously battery technology and its importance is just like booming. I mean, it's booming. So I'm gonna guess like in recent years, it's just like hiring talent is becoming difficult. even more difficult.
You can hire. There are companies, obviously, you can hire. You can hire headhunters, right, to go out there, but you'll pay a premium for that. So we try to avoid that. At some point, we'll have to. We're going to start manufacturing almost certainly in the state of Indiana. And you've got Purdue Engineering there, and Vincennes, which is like a 2 years mechanical engineering degree. So they've got a lot of local talent there. So the talent pool is good. And these are people that have grown up working on tractors, so they have good hand skills. They're not afraid to tackle kind of complicated problems. So I think that'll be a little easier for us in terms of manufacturing. But California's become tricky, because there are a lot of battery companies right now. A lot of there are a number of startups, and they've all been hiring. So everybody's kind of poaching from one another.
And are your core kind of like hiring talent pools like out of like university hotbeds? Is that like kind of or are these folks that like you're more generous?
Mostly, so these are mostly people that they may have recently graduated, but it's a combination of just we obviously advertise that we have positions available. In some cases, people know about PolyPlus, so they come to us looking for something, but it's we have. So, in general, it's pretty easy to find PhDs. They're actually easier to find than technicians, right? And expensive, right? So you have to be careful who you're hiring. But, the technician pool is actually, even though they're probably in total, a lot of them, everybody needs them. right? Everybody needs these people who do assembly and do repetitive tasks. Not everybody has got the kind of mental makeup for doing, obviously repetitive tasks can get boring, but if you don't do them reproducibly, then you got big problems, right? So,
Absolutely.
If two batteries aren't performing the same, it's either something has gone funny with the chemistry or the guy that put them together screwed up.
Oh,
and
man.
You want to know which one it is.
Absolutely. And you've mentioned that you're going to be manufacturing soon. So, what's in store for PolyPlus in like the next year?
Yeah, well, that's obviously a very different DNA, right? So that's a different type of person in a way. So we have a strategic investor that's done a lot of large scale manufacturing. So we'll tap into their expertise in that area, but there's all the ISO, certification that has to happen. Obviously we have to, build up the manufacturing team. We're going to need a general manager. So there's just a whole, and any battery manufacturing plant is going to need there's certain equipment, right, that you have to have, like dry rooms, which basically dehumidify the air. So lithium metal, which is sensitive to moisture, doesn't get contaminated. So the whole host of kind of infrastructure problems, and then, bringing in the team and growing that team at the right rate, and then certification of so you start building those batteries, they have to be certified, tested. There's a whole lot that has to happen.
That's exciting stuff, though. Are you making a bunch of trips to Indiana right now? Like scoping?
I've made a bunch of them, yes. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So we've kind of located a building. We have Indiana is very pro-business. They have low energy costs, a skilled talent pool. So then they definitely check all the boxes. And they're nice people. They've been super, I would say, more than outgoing in trying to recruit PolyPlus to manufacture there. So I now know a bunch of the locals. So
cool.
We had a meeting with the governor. So,
wow. That's amazing.
Doing that in California is a little tougher.
Yeah. No, I mean, it sounds like California is like, it is tough. It is like everything. It's just like, it's so,
well, it's very entrepreneurial, right? You've got a lot of innovative, creative, high energy people. All that part is all good. It's a good place to innovate, but very few people manufacture here,
Yeah, totally. Yeah. Well, Steve, I just have two more closing questions. And thank you for your time.
Sure,
and so the first question I have is, if you could give advice to your 21-year-old self, what would it be?
Wow, that's a tough one. Yeah, that's a tough one. It's probably going to be something, a little cheesy, like follow your dream. Because that's certainly, and what I mean by that is not that it's a specific, not, for me, it wasn't a very specific thing. Like, I want to grow a battery company. Certainly not. It was not that. But, each step of the way, I was moving in a direction that was exciting. Right. So, I actually had a number of offers from industrial players early on in my career. But they didn't excite me. They weren't things that I wanted to do. And so I kind of chose the more, what's the word for it? Kind of uncharted path, right? Where it wasn't clear where it was going to lead. And then you just hope that you make good decisions as you move along that path. And then, in my case, it worked out very well because we ended up, launching a company, and we've done the same within the company, right? We've launched a bunch of really wild kind of technologies that are now getting ready to pay off. So I think, that's a kind of it's not maybe succinct, but I think you just have to kind of, move in a direction that you feel is a good match for what you want to do in life. It's going to keep you excited. The best kind of job is the job that you want to go to every day.
That resonates. That truly resonates.
You can end up in that situation where, every day is exciting. Every day is something new. There are challenges, around every corner. If you like that kind of thing, and entrepreneurs usually do, then that will pay off. It'll pay off.
And I was going to say, like, as it reminded me of your story of like when you had to fight a lawsuit like right out the gate.
Yeah.
Like if you didn't like what you were doing, you could have easily thrown in the towel.
Oh yeah.
But like there's there's like a certain amount of like following your passion allows you to like get through that like really tough times.
Precisely.
Yeah, that really resonates with me. And my last closing question, are there any kind of like shout outs you want to give for anyone that supported you along the way?
Yeah, it would probably be, well, Donna. I mean,
yeah, of course.
Hi,
Donna.
And Rudy was a very instrumental force in the evolution of PolyPlus. Because when I start, I'm a child of the 60s. So, it was a Vietnam War protest. There was a lot of, rebellion against the status quo and capitalism. And, so when I first entered kind of the academic sphere, I definitely had a distrust of business, and businessmen, and thought that most of these people were just, purely motivated by greed and avarice. And, so I didn't have a high opinion of that class of person. And Rudy changed that very much. So, Rudy Hurwitz was a really kind of a phenomenal human being. He was actually on Richard Nixon's enemies list. That was one of his proud achievements, actually. Claim that as one of his proud achievements, because he, back when the Vietnam War was being protested, and most people, looked at that as just it was academia, right? All these college students going out and protesting. But Rudy in the Bay Area was organizing businessmen to fight against what was happening there.
Wow.
So, and when he passed away some years ago, and when he did, there was a memorial for Rudy, and there must have been 400 people in that room, and a good number of those people stood up and described how he either saved their company or encouraged them to follow some entrepreneurial dream that they had and help them build a company. And it was like one after the, and these are, I didn't know any, I would never have known those stories if I hadn't gone to his memorial. So, there are some very good people engaged in building companies. And I certainly didn't know that, when I was a kid. Probably would have thought the opposite. So, you can kind of have your cake and eat it too that way. You can do the right thing, build a good company, work with good people, and end up feeling quite satisfied, when you look back on it all. So that is just distinctly possible, can be done. But, you have to be very disciplined in your approach to how you do these things so you can feel good about all of it.
Absolutely. And I couldn't agree more. I think, everything you described about Rudy and what I've learned thus far about Rudy, it sounds like I would have gotten along with him really well. And
I absolutely. At some point you should look him up. He was on the cover of Time magazine when they started Dymo. So
wow. That's amazing.
Yeah. Really remarkable.
Oh, man. Well, Steve, thank you again for your time. I really appreciate it.
It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, and maybe next time we'll do like a specific, next time we have you on, we'll do a specific deep dive into like the nitty gritty of like tech transfer, or we'll double click on something. But thanks again. I'd love to have you on, whenever, and appreciate it.
Sounds good. All right.
That's all for today's episode of the Biotech Startups Podcast. We hope you enjoyed our 3-part series of conversations with Steve Visco. Be sure to tune in to our next series, where we will be chatting with James Evans, co-founder and CEO of Fenavista Biosciences. James is an industry-leading expert in fluorescence imaging and informatics, and has been heavily influenced in the commercialization of life science research for technology platforms and drug discovery. The Biotech Startups Podcast is brought to you by Exceeder. Don't want to miss an episode? Make sure to search for Biotech Startups Podcast in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts, and click subscribe. To learn more about our leasing program, visit our website, www.excedr.com. We provide research labs with equipment leases on founder-friendly terms to support a path to exceptional outcomes. On behalf of the team here at Exceeder, thanks for listening.